You can spend 6 hours on a project nobody asked you to do, but ask you to spend 20 minutes on a task someone else assigned you. And suddenly your brain fights back with everything it has. You're not lazy. You're not undisciplined. You're something psychology actually has a name for: selectively motivated. And once you understand what's happening inside your brain, the pattern stops feeling like a character flaw and starts making a strange kind of sense. Here's the first thing researchers found. Motivation isn't one single force that you either have or don't have. Psychologists Edward Deci and Richard Ryan spent decades studying this and built what's now called self-determination theory. They found that humans have 3 core psychological needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. When a task satisfies those needs, motivation appears almost automatically. When it doesn't, no amount of willpower can force it into existence. Autonomy is the one that matters most for you. It's the need to feel like you're choosing an action, not being pushed into it. Competence matters too. You need to feel capable of doing the task well, not just capable of finishing it. The moment the task becomes "you have to" instead of "I want to," something in your brain quietly disengages, even if you're fully capable of doing the work. That disengagement even has its own name. Psychologist Jack Brem called it psychological reactance. His research found that when people feel their freedom to choose is restricted, they experience a surge of motivation to reclaim that freedom, often by resisting the very thing they are being pushed toward. Tell a selectively motivated person "you must," and part of their brain immediately starts building a case for why they won't. Think about how differently this plays out at home. Cleaning your own apartment because you decided it needed it feels almost satisfying. Being told to clean your room by someone else can make the exact same task feel unbearable, even though the physical work is identical. The task hasn't changed. Your relationship to the choice behind it has. Then there's the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation comes from inside you. You do something because it's interesting or meaningful on its own terms. Extrinsic motivation comes from outside. You do something for a grade, a paycheck, or someone else's approval. Deci ran a famous experiment where he paid people to solve puzzles they already enjoyed. Once the money appeared, their interest in the puzzles dropped, and it stayed lower even after the payment stopped. He called this the over-justification effect. External rewards can quietly weaken an internal drive that was already there. This explains something you probably noticed about yourself. The moment a hobby becomes a job, or a passion becomes an obligation, some of the joy leaks out of it. It's not that you've changed as a person. It's that your brain has reclassified the activity from chosen to required, and that single reclassification changes everything about how motivated you feel toward it. There's also a neurological piece to this. Researcher William Dodson has studied what he calls an interest-based nervous system, most commonly documented in people with ADHD, though the underlying pattern shows up more broadly across the population. In an interest-based system, motivation isn't driven mainly by importance, deadlines, or consequences. It's driven almost entirely by whether something feels interesting, novel, urgent, or personally meaningful right now, in this exact moment. A task can be objectively critical and still generate zero motivation if none of those triggers are present. That's why you can ignore a deadline for weeks and then finish an entire project in one frantic, hyper-focused night. The urgency finally became real enough to trigger the system. It isn't a discipline problem at all. It's a different motivational engine running on entirely different fuel. Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's research on flow adds another layer here. Flow states, those periods of total absorption in a task where time seems to disappear, require a very specific balance. The challenge has to match your skill level. And critically, you have to feel a real sense of control over what you're doing and how you're doing it. His studies found that people rarely enter flow while performing tasks assigned entirely by someone else, no matter how skilled they are at the task itself. Autonomy isn't a bonus ingredient for deep focus. It's a requirement. Your locus of control matters here too. Psychologist Julian Rutter identified this concept decades ago. It describes whether you believe outcomes are driven mostly by your own choices, called an internal locus, or mostly by outside forces, called an external locus. People with a strong internal locus tend to feel demotivated fastest when tasks are imposed on them, because imposed tasks quietly contradict their core belief that their own choices should be the thing driving the outcome. There's a version of this pattern that looks like laziness from the outside but genuinely isn't. Researchers studying self-determined motivation found that people who experience low autonomy over long stretches of time can develop something close to learned helplessness, a state where a person simply stops trying, not because they don't care, but because past experience taught them that effort doesn't reliably change the outcome. If most tasks in your life have felt imposed rather than chosen, your brain may have quietly concluded that trying is pointless, even for things that genuinely matter to you. This is also why selectively motivated people often show what looks like a contradiction. Total burnout at a job that pays the bills, paired with founding a business at night, training obsessively for a marathon, or building something ambitious in their spare time with no external pressure at all. It's not that you lack drive. Your drive is completely intact and fully functional. It simply refuses to activate for anything that arrives wrapped in obligation instead of choice. Some psychologists describe this as an autotelic tendency, a term Psych also used for people who are strongly driven by internally generated goals rather than externally imposed ones. Autotelic people aren't unmotivated in any general sense. They are selectively wired to respond to meaning, curiosity, and self-directed challenge, and largely unresponsive to pressure, deadlines, or authority operating on their own. Relatedness, the third need in self-determination theory, plays a role too. You tend to stay motivated longer on a task when you feel some genuine connection to the reason behind it, whether that's a person, a cause, or a value you hold. Strip away autonomy and relatedness at the same time. Hand someone a task with no say in it and no meaningful connection to why it matters, and motivation tends to collapse the fastest. This is also why just manage your time better rarely works as advice for you. Time management assumes the problem is scheduling. But if the real issue is that a task feels imposed rather than chosen, a better calendar won't fix it. You'll still stare at the same block of time-labeled assignment and feel the same wall go up, no matter how well it's organized on paper. Deci and Ryan's later research applied this same framework outside of hobbies and work, into areas like medication adherence and exercise habits. They consistently found that people who felt autonomously motivated, choosing a health behavior because they personally valued it, stuck with it far longer than people who felt controlled into the same behavior by doctor's order or partner's pressure. The pattern isn't limited to productivity. It shows up anywhere a person is asked to sustain effort over time. Workplace researchers have found something similar. Psychologists Richard Hackman and Greg Oldham studied what makes jobs feel motivating and found that autonomy over how work gets done was one of the strongest predictors of genuine engagement, often mattering more than salary. Jobs designed around rigid, externally controlled steps consistently produce lower motivation, even among employees who are highly skilled and well compensated for the work. So what actually helps? If you recognize yourself in this pattern. Research on autonomous supportive environments gives a fairly consistent answer. When people are given even small amounts of choice inside a required task, choosing the order of steps, the method, or the framing, their motivation rises significantly, even though the underlying task hasn't changed at all. Your brain responds to the presence of choice almost as strongly as it responds to the actual content of the task in front of you. You can use this on yourself starting today. Instead of telling yourself, "I have to do this," try finding one part of the task you genuinely get to decide. Which piece to start with. How you'll structure your time. What reward you'll give yourself once it's finished. That small shift from obligation to choice can be enough to unlock the same drive that already shows up effortlessly for the things you truly care about. Understanding this pattern doesn't make every deadline fun, and it doesn't excuse avoiding responsibilities that actually matter to your life. But it does mean the shame so many selectively motivated people carry. The belief that they are broken or fundamentally undisciplined is aimed at the wrong target entirely. You don't have a motivation deficit. You have a motivation system that runs on autonomy, interest, and meaning. And once you learn to work with that system instead of against it, the same intensity you already bring to the things you love becomes something you can reach far more often than you think.